The alternating rosette stitch that I used on my Monotype bag creates this firm textured stitch pattern. It's almost got like a knobbly texture that's more like crochet than most knitted stitch patterns. And I based this on Barbara Walker's Rosette Stitch, which can be found in the second Treasury of knitting patterns. And this is Rosette Stitch. And in this variation, I've basically taken this stitch pattern and changed it a little bit to create a stitch pattern that doesn't have these kind of strong diagonal lines. And the textured rows on Rosette Stitch are worked by working a purl two together, and instead of sliding your stitches that you decreased off the left needle, you leave them on the needle, and then you work into those same stitches again with a knit two together. And that's what creates these little kind of textured knots. And you do that same stitch for all of your texture rows in Rosette Stitch. In this alternating variation, I'm still working that stitch on one of my kind of textured rows, but on my other ones, instead of doing purl two together, knit two together into the same stitch, I did knit two together, purl two together into those same stitches. And that just kind of balances out the strong diagonal so that it kind of zigzags or alternates. And that kind of gave me more of the effect I was looking for this design. And you can find the Monotype bag pattern, which also features an unusual sturdy mesh pattern that I'm calling the bowline mesh stitch. You can find this pattern in my Knitworthy 8 collection. And I'm going to show you how to work the alternating rosette stitch on a swatch. In the bag, this stitch pattern is worked flat for the base, and then in the round, it's very simple to switch between working it flat and working it in the round, because the alternate rows are purled when you're working flat and knit working in the round. So I'm just going to show you how to do it working flat, because the rows we care about, those textured rows, are the same either way. For this swatch, I cast on an odd number of stitches plus 2 selvage stitches, and I'm just going to slip my first selvage stitch at the beginning of a row. So my first row is going to be knit 2 together. So I've got 2 stitches here. I'm going to work knit 2 together, just as I normally would for a decrease. But once I've pulled my new stitch through, I'm not going to slide my original 2 stitches off the left needle. I'm going to leave them in place. And then I'm going to purl those 2 stitches together. To purl, I need my yarn up front, so make sure that comes between the needles, or you'll create an accidental yarn over. So then purl 2 together, and then slide the original stitches off. If I drop the yarn for a second, you can see I've decreased 2 stitches and I've ended up with 2 stitches. So this doesn't change your stitch count. You're just trying to create this little textured knot effect. And then I'm going to simply repeat that across the row. So we knit 2 together. I had to think about which row I was on here. And then yarn to the front between the needles, purl 2 together. Knit 2 together, purl 2 together. I would recommend, especially if you're working with a cotton yarn like this, I would definitely recommend using metal needles. And I have the sort of regular Addi Turbos here, which are relatively blunt, but you might also find that it's easier with a sharper needle, because getting into that sort of second decrease can just be a little twisty and tricky. I wouldn't want to use a wooden needle. I'd be a bit afraid of snapping them. So continue like that across the row. At the end of row 1, I've got just 1 stitch left before my selvage stitch. With the selvage stitch, I have 2 stitches, and that's because I started with an odd number. So I'm going to knit that last pattern stitch and then knit my selvage stitch. Rows 2 and 4 are simply purled if you're working flat. If you're working the round, you'll want to knit rounds 2 and 4. I'm going to slip my selvage stitch and then purl across. For row 3, or my second textured row, we're going to do something very similar, but instead of knit 2 together, purl 2 together, it's going to be purl 2 together, knit 2 together. And we're also going to offset it by 1 stitch. So instead of ending with knit 1, I'm going to begin with knit 1. So I've slipped myself a stitch, knit 1, and then I'm going to do purl 2 together, knit 2 together. And here I'm going to be decreasing a pair of stitches that is 1 stitch from each of my decreases on the row below. So that's what I mean by offsetting. So yarn to the front, purl 2 together, don't slide those 2 stitches off, and then yarn to the back between the needles and knit 2 together. And repeat that across the row. So purl 2 together, knit 2 together. So continuing to the end of the row. So here at the end of the row, I've worked my last kind of decrease texture stitch, and I've just got my 1 selvage stitch left. If you are knitting in the round, you will find that to create kind of a seamless end of round without like a knit stitch running up the middle, you will want to move your end of round by 1 stitch between each of the textured rows. So I move that like back and forth so that my end of the round doesn't keep shifting diagonally. If you are interested in further directions for that, do check out the Monotype Bag pattern. And that includes full directions for how to work it in the round and shift the end of the round. On the Monotype Bag, I use this Alternating Rosette Stitch for the top section and the base. And then at the very top, I wanted something really nice and firm for this top border and for the handles, and that wouldn't kind of curl up for this narrow strip of the handle. And so I worked an extra dense version of this stitch pattern by simply omitting the plain rounds. So I just worked rounds 1 and 3 in the round, leaving out any plain knit rounds, rounds 2 and 4. And that gave me this really great, super dense stitch pattern that I think worked really well for the handles. Whether you use the Alternating Rosette Stitch for the Monotype Bag pattern or for your own project, I think it would actually make a really fantastic dishcloth. Just worked in a square. But whatever you use it for, I would love to see. You can share your projects on Instagram and tag me as @Azolda. And you could also leave a link in the comments down below. And do use the comments for any questions as well. And don't forget to subscribe to see more tutorials and projects from me.